Hi, everybody. Welcome to Radical Civility. My name is Ben Piccini. Tonight we are talking about informed consent in religion. Two of my friends, Dan and Leo, wrote a piece together for Public Square magazine that talks specifically about informed consent. What does that mean? And specifically, what does it mean for religion? So informed consent, you go to a used car lot, and before you buy the car, you get to have a report and a lot of other stuff to make sure that you're not buying a lemon. Well, how do you know if the religion you're buying into is the right one to buy into? And what can you do if you decide that it wasn't and that they lied to you? Well, that's a really sticky, hard conversation. Religion is one of those parts of our identity that is deep and profound and personal. When people leave or change religions, that's a pivotal moment in their life. And so this is a little bit longer than normal. We did that on purpose. I didn't want to cut anything out because I wanted to give us time to be thoughtful and to attack things as carefully as we could. I also don't trust my editing capacity to cut out the fluff and not leave everything else intact. And so I've left things as they are so that you can hear us really trying to wrestle both with what people on the other side are saying, but also to wrestle with our own feelings. And I think one thing that you'll hear is that I am better for having had this conversation. I don't think that I take the view of my intellectual opponents. I don't think that any church has an obligation to publish certain things or anything like that. And in fact, I come down a little bit strong on the other side, that we need to trust people and people need to do their own research. But at the same time, having this conversation with Dan and Leo has forced me to think about how am I going to make sure that my children decide to follow the tenets of my faith because they want to and not because I am pushing them? How am I going to make sure that they are doing this on their own account and not because of my bias or because of my control? And that's a really, really good question to ask. And it's hard, and I don't think there are easy answers, and it's tricky. And at the same time, I think it's the right question to ask. One quick note. We recorded this, and then Dan said, I think I used the word apostate. Can you take that out? I haven't taken it out, so I hope that Dan isn't mad at me. The reason I didn't take it out is so just to clarify, the word apostate is someone who rebels against the true faith. And it's a very complicated word, in part because if somebody leaves a faith, it can be used as almost like a slur. I want to be clear that if it was being used in that way, I would have taken it out. Dan is using it in the way that he uses it, actually in almost the opposite sense. He is mocking someone, but he's mocking the people who dismiss an argument because a quote apostate uses it. And I think he's right. I don't want to be that kind of person that says, they left the church, so nothing they say is trustworthy. I will evaluate the claim based on the merits. If he was poking fun, he wasn't actually calling people apostate. He was poking fun at members of churches who don't take arguments into account in good faith. And so I've decided to leave that in as an editorial decision, and hopefully Dan isn't too mad at me about that. But I did want to clarify that it was not meant in any kind of ill will. And I appreciate that. Again, this is a little bit longer because we wanted to be thoughtful and have an extended conversation, and also because I'm not very good at editing out the fluffy parts without losing some of the good parts. With that, I will get out of the way so I don't make it any longer and turn it over to Dan and Leo to talk about informed consent. Thank you both for being here. I'm excited to have you and to talk about this. You two wrote an article for Public Square magazine. And for our listeners / viewers, if you want to take just a second and give me kind of an overview of what was the article and why did you write it? What was the purpose behind that? And then I'll dig in with some questions.
Okay. Well, since I kind of started this problem, Dan, I guess I can begin. So I've been following the former member communities for a long time, for years now, and listening to them as often as I have the energy and time to do so. I rarely respond now. I don't feel like it's necessary to constantly be, trying to fix the bad arguments or the misguided stuff that I hear. It's not necessary for me to constantly be arguing with people. I've reached a place of relative peace in my life. As far as people's different journeys, I feel like the Savior's in control and that he's the master, and he'll, his will be done at some point, whatever that will is. And so when I wrote this article, it was with some hesitation. because I know that people will read. We have, there's never just one audience. It's everyone reads and watches things that you didn't think that they would read and watch, but they did. And so with that in mind, there's someone who, in particular, who wrote a post about informed consent and within a religious context. And I thought that was interesting. And of course, it's been talked about in other former member communities and different former member leaders that have been talking about this. And so when this one particular person that I care about wrote about informed consent and how they had some concerns about it within the church, I started getting to work with my spiritual work that I do. I like to pray about things. I like to read scripture and try to understand things. And so, because it did trouble me, I went through a faith crisis myself 10 years ago, and I've been reconstructing my belief system ever since. And so it's when I hear these arguments and hear the pain, see the pain people have, confusion and heartache and disgust, and they feel like they've been deceived by the church. It does touch my heart, because I've been there and I feel that deeply, the pain of that. And so I wanted to write something that I thought maybe would be maybe a different perspective, perhaps, for people to consider. I didn't necessarily want to dismiss any issues that I know about with the church. I think that there are things that we can address and that we can improve upon. The restoration continues. So I tried to include some of that in the article, but basically it was response. It was an apologetic, if you're going to call it apologetic. I'm not an apologist. I don't consider myself an apologist, but people, someone in particular called it a Mormon apologist piece. So, and I don't label myself that way at all. I'm not a Mormon apologist. But that aside, that label, I wanted to touch people's hearts that are maybe listening to this more simple way of worshiping. And that's kind of where I'm at in my life, is I've reached a place of simplicity in my worship, and I wanted to touch on that in the article.
Dan, what do you want to add to that?
So I saw what Leo did, and I said, hey, let me join in on this. Because I had put together some thoughts kind of in some other contexts that are related. But I echo what Leo said. Like this, sometimes as members of the church, we might be tempted to just wave something off because an apostate said it, right? And that's not my personal approach to things is, if somebody says something, let's try to explore is there a truth that this person is speaking to? And can we really think about it with generosity and not, immediately turn the cannons onto that person and try to shoot them down, right? Let's try to think, is there some truth to what this person is saying? And if so, can we address it in a better way than what they're saying? Or can we point out some things that they might not be understanding? And with this particular issue, I can relate to it. I really can. I can tell you that for years, I always had just kind of a little nagging question / doubt about like our 8-year-old baptism day. Like, gosh, why isn't it 18? Right after we've been able to think through things and process life a little bit more. And I'm not gonna lie, like even nowadays, I kind of wish that we would calibrate our what we give to people in the church better according to their capacity. A lot of times we march people through this system of ordinances and we treat them like rites of passage sometimes. And we kind of march them through when they internally don't have the resources to sustain it. And a lot of people, when they leave, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't feel like I have to fake things anymore. I feel so relieved. And that is a problem, right? Um, that's not directly related to informed consent, but it's kind of related. Like, you know, if I had my way, people would not feel pressure as they meet with our missionaries to be baptized. They would feel invited to come and attend church. And at some point over time, when they have an authentic revelation from God, or just I can't deny that I want this so bad. And I've thought it through. Eliza R. Snow, she was an investigator for 4 years before she joined the church, right? And we, our missionaries, a lot of times are like, okay, I've got to baptize this person next week, right? So it's not, I mean, let's not wave off this concept. Like there is value to making informed decisions, and having the best available information. Where we run into a sharp disagreement with a lot of the disaffected ex-Mormon community is, what constitutes relevant information in making this decision. Okay. If somebody had a vision and had a personal revelation of some kind that led them into this faith, do they need to know the various theories about the Book of Abraham, right? Or these little minutia of church history, or whatever? If somebody has had revelatory experiences in their church service or in the temple and in any number of these contexts, does it matter how many authors there were for the first 5 books of the Bible, for example, or just how much of the Book of Mormon was tightly translated versus loosely translated versus, do any of those things matter? Not really. If you've actually had an authentic encounter with God. And what Leo has put forward is a pretty simple concept. If God says, come follow me, that's, we do have a choice. Do we just do that? Or do we obsess over the minutia, and when does that ever end? Right. So, anyway, that's kind of the gist of the paper or the article. And, but like I said, we would do ourselves a disservice if we were to just wave off all of those concerns and dismiss those as irrelevant, because I don't think they are irrelevant.
I think you two both brought up so many things that I want to talk about, so many different leads that I want to chase down. Let me just start by saying that the purpose of this podcast is to talk about the hardest possible things in ways that don't drive us apart. That's really hard. And we may not get it right today. I think we will. We're going to try really hard. But I cannot think of many things that are harder than religion and ex-religious communities, right? Or former believing communities. And that's probably true in other faiths as well. I'm not saying that only in the context of this church, because there's huge, deep tribalism. There's on both sides, right? I'm not saying on their side. I'm including us too. There's issues of worldview. There's morality that we judge others. Oh, you left because you're a bad person, and all sorts of terrible stuff. So the first thing that I want to say is I have very dear friends, and I'm sure both of you do too, who have left the church, who are in that community. And my love for them does not change. And I did not feel like this article was an attack. I'm sad in a lot of ways that it was interpreted that way. I think that what's tricky is that often tribes have competing narratives. And I think what I read from the article was, hey, I hear that narrative and that's fine. I want to offer you mine. I'm not saying, that there's only one right way and that we're the right ones, but I do want to clarify that we view this differently. And as I saw some of the responses coming back, it's, if you feel like the church has lied to you, then a lot of the comments that I saw are going to make sense. And in my case, I feel like I've been very well informed in my lifetime. I feel like I've been told repeatedly, go and find out for yourself. And I've done that, right? Let me put it this way. There's plenty of things I still don't know. And there are still things that I'm excited to learn, but there aren't very many that have surprised me, right? Certainly not in the last 10 years. Growing up, I cannot think of a time when I was told to leave my brain switched off when I entered worship services. And this is the same kind of extension. It was funny. I was actually telling somebody, I was like, hey, this is really important. We need to, gain our own witness for ourselves. We need to do our own study. And somebody said, well, no, that's just another way they get you. I think they were being honest. I'm like, no, that's not how, no, this is the opposite of that. Like the whole premise is that Joseph Smith walked into a grove of trees and found out for himself and questioned some really deeply held beliefs and actually ended up upsetting some people. So I think that notion is very important to me, that the foundation of my faith is knowing for myself. I remember when I was young, my dad encouraged us to read as much as we could, to find out as much as we could. And he would try to answer the questions, but there was never this idea of, no, don't touch that. That's scary. And I feel like I'm in a really healthy place because of that. So just wanted to put out there a couple of thoughts on it. And the reason why I say that is just to clarify, I'm not saying that other people didn't have it different. There are people who have been dissuaded from trying to do their own research or to find out for themselves, or who haven't had the same experience that I have, and I respect that. But if it becomes a battle of narratives, then I think we both lose. I think the issue is you two wanted to put forward a different narrative than what you were hearing, and I think that that's valid and fair. Leo, it looked like you had something you were going to jump in on, and then I have a couple more things.
Okay, yeah, well, so yeah, it's all good stuff, Ben. So Dan and I have some good friends. One in particular I can mention that I know that we both care about. Her name is Jennifer Roach, and she's a fairly public figure now. She's a convert to the church. And there's other people like her that I know, but I'll talk about her. She's one that watched everything and read everything she could before joining the church, like all the different arguments. And so she had she's pretty well informed before consenting to baptism. And I am, on one end of the spectrum, you have people, I want to just talk about this whole spectrum, people that know pretty much everything before they join. Usually not the 7-year-olds, right? They're getting baptized at 8, obviously. But adult converts, there's quite a few of them today, especially in Western countries, that are doing the research, doing all that hard work before baptism, and listening to all the arguments, right? There's as many as they can find. They're studying it out. But some of us have also met those who have no appetite for that. And Dan kind of hinted at this, is that on the other end of the spectrum, I've met some people in my life, especially on my mission, who would not have wanted to study all of the extra church history and the different arguments against the church. For them, that wouldn't be information. That would just be confusion and not helpful for them to try to work through all that information. What they needed is just to be loved by Jesus. Right? That's all they needed, to feel of his love and to be hugged through baptism. That's what they wanted to do. And Jennifer was hugged through baptism. After all the knowledge, all the information would pass through, and she resolved most of it, I think. But for other people, they don't need that. And so I think Jesus knows that. He has encouraged us to come unto him for the lowest common denominator. I don't want to say people that don't study or low intelligence. I'm just saying that they have a low appetite. So Jesus wants people like that to come unto him. And so that's kind of where I was going with this, is I want people to know that it's okay if someone chooses not to study all that stuff and be baptized, because that's what they need. That's what they want. And that's what Jesus has provided to them as basics of the gospel for them to feel filled as they join the church.
Well, it's funny you say that, Leo. I've been thinking a little bit about a podcast that Dan was on talking about the stages of faith development, I can't remember. It's not Kohlberg. He's moral development. The other guy.
Fowler's stages.
Yeah, Fowler's stages.
And James Fowler.
Something that you said has struck me ever since, which is, stage 3 people are wonderful. and their faith is beautiful. And I think there's a danger in, how do I say this? On the one hand, I want people to find out, and I have a very analytical brain, and I tell people, go and find out, research, do everything you can. I want you, caveat emptor, right? Go and find out for yourself. I want you to know what you're doing before you do this. I say this to my kids. And at the same time, you said this a minute ago, I've entered a stage of my life where it's chosen simplicity. I know there's good, there's light, there's beauty, there's meaning, there's purpose. And I have a lot of questions I don't have answers to, and I'm good with that. And that's okay, right? And at the same time, I think there's a danger in obsessing all the time about the couple of questions that I have or whatever. And I see that sometimes. And so I think that idea of stage 3 faith can be okay. My dad taught me something that was really powerful when I was growing up. He said, given that 8-year-olds can choose to be baptized, that tells you something about how much somebody needs to know before they get baptized at an older age. Not because you don't want them to know more, but because the bar is actually set to be really, I don't want to say low because it's not a low bar, but on certain, the bar is a very clear one, right? And it's not about having a PhD in biblical studies. God can speak to the unlearned as well as to the learned. And again, I'm celebrating going out and getting your own stuff and doing your own research. But if a 50-year-old has the witness of an 8-year-old that they want to follow Jesus, fundamentally, that's actually more important than all of the other things. And I commend the Brigham Youngs of the world who take 2 years, and the Eliza R. Snows and the Jennifer Roaches. That's wonderful. But I also think that I'm not sure that 10 years of study would be enough for some people, because they would still say, well, if you haven't, clearly you haven't done enough research if you haven't started to agree with me yet. And that's kind of the feeling that I got from some of this informed consent discussion was, well, it's not informed enough unless you agree that the church is lying to you. Dan?
Right. So that's correct. And here is the part of my comments that is going to sound kind of harsh. And what it is important to talk to, as you said, to just understand that this discussion is informed by 2 completely different narratives. And so Leo and I have put forward an argument, and the ex-Mormon community, I fully understand why they feel the way they do about it. They have adopted a narrative about the church that it is fundamentally fraudulent, right? And the way that you mitigate a problem of fraud is with better information and more of it. So if that's your starting assumption, is that that you enter into a marketplace, you are likely to be scammed in that marketplace. Gosh, let's arm people with the most information possible before they enter into that marketplace, right? So if that's your starting point, then of course you're going to see the question of informed consent that way, in that light. It's but Christianity, and this is something that's so hard to explain to people. I wrote a blog post, a long blog post about Latter-day Saint epistemology and Christian epistemology in general, but also kind of uniquely Latter-day Saint flavors of epistemology. And if you don't know what epistemology is, it's how we arrive at what we believe and what we know, how we arrive at a confidence that something is true or not. And Christian epistemology is different than other epistemology. Christian epistemology says that the new convert in Guatemala has every bit as much a grasp on reality as does the Harvard-trained theologian who grew up in the church. Okay? And that is something, if that is not your epistemology, if your epistemology is, based on an enlightenment rationality kind of model or whatever, where you're just trying to amass something that sounds logical and and you arrive at what you believe through logical argumentation and debate and voluminous amounts of study of different points of view and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not Christian epistemology. Christian epistemology says, like Leo said, our new converts in the majority world have every bit as much of a grasp on the reality of the gospel as somebody like me who reads a lot of books. So, but with the ex-Mormon community, a lot of people they've shifted away from Christian epistemology that they might have been raised with, and are now in kind of an accusation epistemology. It's just volumes and volumes and volumes of accusation that if they go unanswered, then the church is fraudulent because it's not able to answer all these accusations to everybody's satisfaction. And if your premise is that the church is fraudulent, you will find reasons to support that narrative. You will, whether they're true or not. You'll find those, and in the ex-Mormon community, there are voluminous amounts of accusations and counter narratives to what the church has produced. And so it's very easy to just say, like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff that these people don't know when they're being baptized or going through the temple and serving missions. Stacks and stacks of articles and who knows how many hours of podcasts and stuff. Shouldn't they go through all that before they make these commitments? Because that's their epistemology. But Christianity has a different epistemology. We have a different epistemology than the people who are commenting with hostility towards this article. And when you have a different epistemology, it's impossible really to arrive at some common ground and make some progress.
And receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost, it's something that someone else pointed out as we were discussing. We believe that's our epistemology, is that the Holy Ghost can guide us through some of this information, right? So we're like, let's get baptized and let's study together, So that's completely opposite of what people think that needs to happen, right? Is that learn it all and then get baptized. But we're saying, if you receive the gift of the Holy Ghost and you're in communion with Jesus, partaking of the sacrament, working along the covenant path, that's probably a good time to start learning about some of these difficult topics because you have the Holy Ghost to guide you. So
yeah, and that's an important point. Is when I run into a difficult issue, which doesn't happen as much nowadays because I know the difficult issues pretty well at this point. But from time to time, I get thrown a curveball. And what happens is I fast and I pray and I say, okay, I am walking with Christ through this life. So I want that spirit and I want his guidance to help me think through this issue and process it in a way that's the way he thinks about it, right? If Joseph Smith said or did this or that, it's okay. I want to know how Christ feels about this or that. And I want to know, if he wants me to not worry about it. And if that's what he wants, then I will obey because I love him, and this is who I follow and I'm going to listen. I trust Christ, to walk me through these things. And so it is kind of a chosen simplicity and I don't get wrapped around the axle a whole lot. It's kind of hard to rattle me. And I don't have this intellectual scrupulosity where, oh my gosh, I have to account for every single possible counter argument to every aspect of our faith. Otherwise, I haven't really thought through it. No, because that's just a never ending scrupulosity spiral, right? And there's no reason to do that. We don't do that in the social sciences or the hard sciences. Why would we do it in faith? So
I think intellectual scrupulosity might be my new favorite phrase. That explains what I've seen from many a well-intended seeker. And again, to be clear, I'm kind of an ancient Greek myself, and rationalist and empirical, and I believe in that stuff really profoundly. And yet, there's a point at which it's just a question of, okay, do I want to spend 3 hours on this topic? Or do I want to spend my time doing some good? And there are topics on which I feel like I need to do the research. And most of the time, it's about serving my neighbor and doing the best I can to be a Christ-like person. I have a professor who taught me recently that he asked a rabbi what holiness was. And he said, well, I can't define it, but I can show it to you. They were walking down the street. And he said, that right there, that mother who's tending her children, that's holiness. That man over there who's feeding that pigeon, that's holiness. And the whole point was that he wasn't just talking about holiness. He was talking about the way that this is epistemology again, right? Where it's more than just academic learning, it's becoming something. Now, to be clear, that even that saying that bothers my epistemological sense that I inherited from the Greeks and Descartes and, the prove everything no matter what. And anyway, one of the things that you all did that I want to comment on really quick and kind of get your thoughts on is you did something really compelling. You compared this to 5 or 6 other things in your article. And so I'll quote really quick. My friend died after working in investment banking. In Drop Our Club, desperate doctors counsel each other on quitting the field. How I left the social justice cult. I hope the military doesn't change my brother like it did me. And why you need to leave academia, the sublimated grief of the left behind. I think that made people mad, but also in part because it was kind of on the nose, right? Like it really answered, like, look, buyer's remorse calling it buyer's remorse is not minimizing. It's telling you that buyer's remorse is very real. And to be honest, like I was a Republican for a long time. I feel that like today, right now, I'm embarrassed, right? And I hope that doesn't offend any of my listeners, right? But it's just the reality. And that buyer's remorse of saying, okay, I donated time, I donated effort, I believed in this stuff. There is a sense of betrayal there. And at the same time, I think that this, is how much could they publish for me to say, okay, now I'm comfortable being a Republican? And the answer is at some point you have to take a step into the darkness. We call that a leap, maybe a leap of faith. And that I think is another word that bothered a lot of people, which is, yeah, but you do in fact take a leap of faith when you're in a marriage or when you commit to a 4-year institution for higher education. Or, I mean, a lot of these require much more knowledge than you're going to get even with a close, perusal. So wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Dan. I'll let you.
Go ahead, Leah. What?
Well, I'll let you start, Dan. You go ahead.
Well, the basic idea is it's kind of, as you said, Benjamin, there's a lot of commitments that we make that buyer's remorse is one way of thinking about it, but there's also just, oh my gosh, I didn't. So I'm going through this process, or I've made this commitment, this huge investment of time, energy, my soul, my allegiance, whatever. And I didn't know it was going to be this hard. Or, in the case of academia, there's a lot of people who go into academia with this idea that, I get to just enter the marketplace of ideas and put forward my arguments and let those stand or fall on their merits. And then once they're in academia, once they're actually like looking for employment, they see just how dishonest that process can be sometimes, and the amount of favoritism and just politicking and greed that governs a lot of these things. And they might think, oh my gosh, academia is rotten to the core as a result, right? But some people make adjustments and just say, okay, this is just human nature at work in this institution that I've committed to, and I'm going to make the best of it. So anyway, Leo?
Yeah, so as far as like buyer's remorse, I mean, I've experienced some really bad transactions before in my life. We had someone come and clean out our air ducts when we first moved into this old house, and it wasn't done well, and we were told that it would be, and that kind of situation, you know, is really painful because we lost some money. But we have people who have spent 30, 40, 50, 60, sometimes probably 70 or more years in the church, and they've given a lot of money to tithing. They've given lots of time to your missions. They've taught things that now they think are false. You know, this is a big buy, right? This is huge. And so we got a lot of pushback from even members of the church who had real concerns about these different analogies, right? And they said, this is not even close. And I hear you. I hear those people. I understand we're talking about this is an eternal thing. This is not like, you know, going to the gym and losing a year, you know, a bad gym membership or something, you know, or having your air ducts not get clean. This is your eternity. This is your eternal family. This is your community. This is your spouse. This is your kids. We talk about faith crisis. We talk about identity crisis, where it's your whole identity that's in crisis. When you start to learn these things and your trust shifts from the church to former members who have, you know, are sharing information that you didn't know before. And so this becomes a question also of responsibility. So who has a responsibility with this huge transaction between us and this church to disclose this information or to seek it out, right? And as members, you know, we want to defend our position and say, hey, so it's our responsibility. Don't blame people. Like, you know, pull the Brene Brown card, right? Don't blame. Be responsible. Do the research. But you don't know what you don't know. And I've had that situation before many times where I don't know what I don't know. And I think there is some room, definitely, for us to say, our church, our missionaries, for example, we could do a lot more to say, hey, let's have a conversation let's have one lesson about church history. Okay, you know what? That would not do a lot of harm. I think it would actually do a lot of good. And I'm not church history department. I'm not the missionary department. I'm not going to be able to tell the church what to do. I'm not going to try to be criticize or whatever, or blame anybody. But I am saying that there is room for, and another big argument they've been making is about gaslighting, right? They say that we're gaslighting them because we're saying that our covenants are with God and not with the church. And we're asking them to take responsibility in some way in this article. And that wasn't their experience, right? Growing up in the church or whatever, or being converted to the church and then not receiving this information. They think that we're gaslighting them, that we're saying it's their fault for not studying more. And so I hear all those arguments. And I just wanted to point that out, that my heart goes out to people who are listening to this. If they do and they're upset with the church, they've left the church, I hear you. I almost did myself. And so there's definitely room for improvement in our church. I think, and that's coming from someone who just wrote an article that's basically saying to take responsibility and that simple faith is good. So hopefully that helps people to feel like we're trying to build a bridge instead of just attack. So we love you.
Yeah, that term gaslighting, so that's probably its own podcast, but
well, and it should be, but I was about to say obligatory reference to Dan's article on gaslighting because it's great.
yeah, I did a blog post on it a while ago, just because gaslighting has come to mean like anything that doesn't validate my perception of things, right? And I'm being gaslit. Somebody's gaslighting me. I'm in pain, and they are not validating all of my perceptions about why I'm in pain and who's to blame for it and so on and so forth. So they're gaslighting me. And that's not gaslighting. Okay, that's honest disagreements of opinion, even like really, really important disagreements of opinion, are not necessarily gaslighting. Like having a different perception of the way things are and what matters, and what things are consequential and what things are not, and all of those kinds of things are disagreements. They're not gaslighting. So anyway, that's something that bears reminding.
Well,
But
can I
yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
be rude and interrupt because I want to say something on that point? That's not merely a pedantic definitional issue, because what it carries with it is actually placing intent on what's going on, and that's the narrative issue, right? And again, if you believe in a different narrative, that's you, right? Whatever you do, that's up to you. I want to set the record straight for myself about what I believe. If you're going to call the church fraudulent, that presupposes that again is a narrative kind of trigger, right? And what it's saying is that there are people who are lying who know they are lying, and that's the best way to characterize the overall general position of the church. And that's something that when I look at it, just is not accurate, is not what I see. I don't have any general authorities in my ward. I never have. I don't know of any of the apostles. We're not on a first name basis. And yet every experience that I have had is that they are honest and that they are kind and that they are telling the truth, and that, hello, little guy, that they, I am not mama, I'm daddy, but I'll set you right here. That they might be accused of really deeply believing in what they believe in and being zealots. That's an accusation that makes sense logically. It doesn't make sense to me that they are both full believers and fraudulent and lying to you. And I think that's actually, to me, is a really important point. I by the way, there are people in the past, and there are certainly examples of times when people have not been fully honest about the truth. I think that Richard Bushman has said something that has been ridiculously taken out of context in an almost embarrassing fashion. But basically is saying, hey, we should be as honest as we possibly can be about the narrative of the church. And we need to refine that and become more nuanced and tell people as much truth as we can. I support all of that. I think that's absolutely right. And trying to prepackage a narrative has some dangers to it. I still don't think that that's the same thing as being fraudulent or lying.
You're right. And there's a concept that I bring up pretty frequently. I have like 4 notes that I play all the time. One of them is epistemology, but one of them is something called plausibility structures. Again, I'll repeat that: plausibility structures. So when we talk about what's plausible, those are things that we're capable of believing. I find this plausible. I don't find that plausible. I can believe this. I can't believe that, right? So plausibility structures are just mental frameworks that we have. So think of like a little Lego structure, right? And I build kind of a box out of Legos, and I can put things in it, okay? A plausibility structure is, it's the worldview and biases and life experience and those things that combine in our hearts and minds that allow us to believe some things and not believe other things. So faith crisis is, and maybe faith crisis, I don't know, let's go ahead and go with it. What faith crisis is I grow up believing certain things, and I grow up and I develop this plausibility structure in my brain. And then I come across other information, or different narratives, more nuanced narratives, or just critical narratives, period, that make these things that once used to fit in my plausibility structure, now they don't fit anymore. And that's frustrating. And a lot of times it's like, okay, I've been lied to, I need somebody to blame. And, and when you go down that path, and I'm going to be blunt, I've been down that path, Leo's been down that path, you it, you end up sometimes having to develop your own narratives about other people and their motives and those things, and in order to make the church, the reality of the church, fit within your plausibility structure. So why is it that so many members of the church grow up well-adjusted adults with good critical thinking skills and able to really think through difficult issues, and they still love the gospel and enjoy the gifts of the Spirit and all of those things? Why does that happen? Well, if that's not your experience, then you might, if you're in one of these communities, you're going to be constantly trying to formulate narratives as to why that is the case with those people. And, oh gosh, they're being dishonest. They've internalized this or that, you know, bad, unhealthy thinking that allows them to minimize or ignore these facts or those facts. And so you have to develop all these narratives about good people, honest people, thoughtful, intelligent people who love the gospel, right? And that way, the reality of what you're seeing, you can make the church, these facts about the church and the good that it does fit within your plausibility structure. And that's a shame. A plausibility structure can change. You can expand it. A good example would be evolution. Some people grow up with the simple biblical idea of the creation of the world, and then they reinterpret it. They might synthesize a belief in evolution or something so that their plausibility structure is flexible and it can accommodate scripture, right? But yeah, like if you're needing to explain why you feel the way you do, you're hurt and aggrieved, and yet some people are not that way, you're going to develop a narrative. And a narrative of fraud and deception is what allows, it's trying to make, these observations fit within your plausibility structure. So anyway, that's a concept that it's one of the notes that I play over and over again wherever I go, because it's really important. And that's part of what's at work here in these heated arguments over these kinds of things.
And what I'm hearing you say, if I'm catching this correctly, is there's nothing wrong with arriving at a conclusion based on evidence and where you are. There's also nothing wrong with constructing a narrative. In fact, you're not going to be able to not do that. That's something your brain takes care of for you. But
correct.
What I'm hearing you say is be aware of that narrative. In the same way that we have these plausibility structures about the church growing up, and we've always kind of taken a simple view, it's really easy to flip to just another equally simplistic narrative that says, oh, it's fraudulent and they're bad people, and that makes me feel better.
And that's why, and Benjamin, that's why a lot of people say when people abandon faith, they don't stop being religious, right? They gravitate to new authority figures, new narratives of what fallenness is and what sin is and good and evil, and new narratives of what goodness and badness are, and all of those kinds of things. And that's something that a lot of people have observed about the ex-Mormon community. They've said this actually looks and feels a lot like the church. And several prominent ex-Mormons have actually remarked that, like, oh my gosh, we're just recreating, this need to have these neat and tidy narratives about things, so, but what Leo and I and a lot of people have done is we have found reasons to be more flexible and like really be patient as we interrogate these issues. And not try to solve it in a podcast, even a podcast that runs like 2 days long, right? Maybe take a year to think about an issue. Maybe fast about it 20, 30, 40 times before you arrive at your conclusions about it. And just patiently walk with God through these issues. But that, if you don't have experience with that, then yeah, it's easy to get into this mindset where you're just taking some of your religious reflexes and transferring them to an anti-religious framework.
So I want to, now seems like a good time. I want to kind of steelman the other side for a minute and ask about some of the things that I heard and ask you to kind of respond to them. I hope it's not playing devil's advocate, because I don't think these people are devils, but there are some things that I heard and I, broadly agreed with your article and I thought it was thoughtful. One of the ones that I heard, but I want to pose them to you anyway, give you a chance to respond.
Okay.
One of them that I heard was, calling it faith can hide a multitude of sins. Telling people just believe, don't worry so much, just be a good person, it'll all work out. Can be both minimizing, but can also that's the kind of thing that you hear cult leaders say too, right? You're just not believing hard enough. You need to slow down and just don't worry about the things that don't make sense. It'll work itself out. For now, you just need to, pray, pay, and obey. I have my own reasons why I don't agree with some of those things. But I want to get your take on what you think about that. Leo, do you want to kick that one off? How would you respond to somebody who's feeling like, okay, you keep invoking faith, and faith can be that can be code for just be quiet and stop asking impertinent questions?
Yeah. One of my people that I follow, I won't say who it is, but he's a big proponent of this argument about the bite model, right? So talks a lot about how we're a cult because we fit this bite model. And I just want to say that point of view, it's logical. It makes sense. I have two different hats I can wear now. I wear my believer hat and I wear my former member hat. I never actually resigned, but I was basically there mentally. I was physically in, mentally out is what it is. PIMO is what it's called. And so I understand where this argument's coming from is we're just coercing people, power hungry. The leaders, maybe they kind of believe it, but they like the power that they have. They like the stipends that they get. We're trying to control the masses. So if the church is based on fraudulent claims, the reality is the church is just a man-made church. Then yes, I agree 100%. We probably shouldn't be having our kids seeing Follow the Prophet as kids. We probably shouldn't have them baptized at 8 years old. The service that we do is great, but you can do service anywhere. But if our church is actually led by Christ, and our prophets have priesthood keys, and there was actually golden plates, or that had the appearance of gold, right? Tembaga plates. And if Joseph really did talk to angels, then all of this call for faith and to follow is valid. So it's like, what do you believe? Do you believe that the church really is based on fraudulent claims and that's your reality? Then our church is definitely a cult in your eyes, and I can see why you think that. But if you gain a strong witness through research, through prayer, through my heart and mind, both, that's what I've been able to do. Hopefully that's more people can do that too if you haven't. But mind and heart, and you can feel and come to really strongly believe, or perhaps know, that the church is based on true claims, then faith is a good call. It's a good approach, and that would make sense for God to say, please believe and follow. So I just want to say I see both sides. They both make sense to me, and I would just be my time would be spent saying, if you have a desire to believe, if you want to work through some of these challenges that you have related to the church and you'd like to come back somehow, or try to wrestle with it again and maybe interact with someone who has deep empathy, then reach out to me or to Dan or anybody, one of our friends. We've all of us really care about people. So I just don't want to say that blatantly you're wrong, or that you're, that you're dumb for believing that faith is a cop out. I see where you're coming from, for sure. So that's all I'll say, is just that I love you and my heart's there for you guys that are hearing this.
So Benjamin, this question of, okay, faith can, I don't want to say hide a multitude of sins, because that's almost like an improper scripture reference.
That was 100% an improper scriptural reference from me.
Yeah. But
I mean the word faith. I don't mean the concept of faith, which I
Yeah.
very much agree with. But people throw around faith loosely to cover problems.
Yeah, just have faith. Don't look behind the curtain. Don't look at the sausage factory. Don't look how the sausage is made. Just enjoy the sausage, right? That's I get that, but so I'm not somebody who can just do the faith part. Like I study, and I just have a curiosity. Like I'm kind of a higher information person than a lot of people who I hang out with and people I go to church with. But there are, just generally speaking, millions and maybe billions of people throughout the history of the world have had a simple faith and lived a life based on a simple faith and have been phenomenal citizens and family members and friends and lived great lives just by having a simple faith where they're not obsessing over the minutia of whatever, whether it's like the provenance of scripture or the problem of evil or any number of other vexing issues. Many, many people throughout the history of the world have had a simple faith and produced great lives and great families in a simple faith. Why are we so superior to these people? Because we obsess over minutia, and we get wrapped around the axle by whatever unresolvable issues. Are we superior to all these people, throughout the world? That just strikes me as honestly kind of an arrogant point of view. There are many, many people with very simple faith who I just, I admire them to no end. I think they're just absolutely incredible people. And I don't think they're missing out. I don't think they're living in denial. They just have a simple faith, period. And that's the way it's always been.
It's always struck me. I feel like Joseph Smith had kind of a radical egalitarian streak. Where on the one hand, he was doing everything he could to learn Hebrew. And on the other hand, how did somebody put it? He was a very different kind of socialist, I think is the way that I heard it said. I think this was Bushman, where his kind of socialism was to help the poor, but he didn't really, he thought the rich were great, right? It wasn't anti-rich, it was pro-poor. And I see that even in terms of learning. The Book of Mormon talks a lot about those who have extra opportunities for learning, segregating against those who don't. And so I want to note that you're saying this from the perspective of someone who has had those opportunities. You're not, casting stones at the people who like to read books or anything like that. You're saying it as one of those people. And I feel the same way, the curiosity and, get as much learning as you can. And I would love to go back and get a master's degree in, ancient Hebrew, and it would just be really cool, right? And at the same time, for the universe that I conceive of, that where God is the head of it, to make sense and be fair and just, means that a regular person with not all that information still has access to the divine by necessity. Like it has to be that way. All right, let me ask you another question, and that has to do with, it was interesting because a number of people, my first reaction when I read your article and I read the comments was, guys, caveat emptor. I don't mean to be unkind, but this is on you. Like fundamentally, this is on you. And somebody, thoughtfully said, well, what about the FDIC? What about the Financial Consumer Protection Bureau, FCPB, or whatever it is? Do you disagree with those? And I said, well, yes, I do, actually. Sorry to be consistent, but I like the best protection is for you to have open eyes. And there's no government agency that can protect you from a loan shark better than you can, right? And I say this to my students. There's, campus can, there's a letter that's sent out about campus safety, and it's particularly talking about dating. And I tell them, what's the most important thing you can do? And we have this long conversation about, well, the most important thing you can do is go on first dates with a roommate. And the most important thing, and I said, no, the most important thing you can do is realize that you're the most important thing in this equation, that you can be aware, you can be thoughtful, you can protect yourself. Right. And how you decide to do that is going to be up to you and circumstances and all of that. And so I had this really strong reaction of like, guys, caveat emptor. I think one valid response to that was, okay, but you're an 8-year-old kid. How much caveating can you do? Right. How do you do that? So I want to grapple with this issue of, okay, you're 8 years old, you're baptized into the church. Where do you go with that? And at what point, and again, to kind of steelman their view, I think we have some really strong incentive structures that encourage people in the faith. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't apologize for it, but it can very quickly lead you to a place where you're going, oh, wow, I've kind of done this for social and societal reasons, not actual for my own personal reasons. So how would you respond to the 8-year-old child kind of question?
I can start, I guess. It's a tough one. Someone in a conversation I was having on, I won't say who, but they said that they had shared with their 7-year-old about Joseph's plural marriage, Book of Abraham, multiple First Vision accounts, and went through the list with their 7-year-old and then asked, are you sure you want to be baptized? And the 7-year-old said, no, I don't want to follow that bad person. And it was clearly from someone that wasn't a believer and probably didn't want their child to be baptized, right? That's my guess. I don't know for sure. I didn't really talk to the person afterwards, but that's what they shared, and they left the conversation. And I think that's really interesting, right? Is how far, what's age appropriate? How much information do they need to have before they make a decision to be baptized? And I think all those are valid questions. But my answer to that is, it all comes down to the covenant is with God, right? It's okay for a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old, as young as you can go, to have a relationship with Jesus. That's okay. Especially if Jesus is real, right? If he's not real, it's still pretty good because Jesus is a pretty awesome character and teaches good things. So I think it's okay for kids to have a relationship with Jesus. And the decoupling we have to do between Jesus and this institution that we call the church is a difficult work to do because we don't want to decouple it too far. But interestingly, the most prominent critics of the church, they like to tie those two together, right, as one and the same. And I don't blame them because there's been language in different places throughout our history that have tied loyalty to the church and to the leaders, right? Deferring to leaders, honoring leaders. And we have to have all these different words and what they mean. Do we agree with leaders, right? Do we honor? Do we sustain? What does all that mean? And so covenants, as far as I can tell, our covenants are always with the Father, right? And the Savior, right? Because they're one and the same. So I'm happy with a 7-year-old that's preparing for baptism that knows very little about church history because they don't care to know that stuff. I've tried with my kids. I've said, hey, for family home evening this night, family night, let's talk about Joseph and the seer stone. And they're like, yeah, cool. How did he do it? We put it in a rock and a hat, and it's really cool. And like, wow, that's really cool, Dad. Like, yeah. And we even talked about the first vision account. So we talked about it. But like we talked about narrative or plausibility structure, worldview, or what else? What other word? All these different ways our perception is different, right? We perceive all these things differently. As someone who's found reconciliation with all these issues, I can inform my kids age appropriate. But at the end of the day, I talked to my little girl. She's going to be baptized in a couple months, and we talked about her name is Charlotte. Charlotte, do you love Jesus? Me too. Do you want to? Jesus will baptize. Do you want to follow Jesus? Yeah, Dad. So to me, that's beautiful. That's simple. It's okay. She's not making covenants to Joseph Smith or to President Nelson or to even to the institution in any way. The institution's a tool. We go through the institution throughout our lives to help us to come unto Jesus. And as long as I think she's coming to Jesus the best way that she can, hopefully through the rest of her life, even if she exits the church and she continues to follow Jesus, I will rejoice, because Jesus is the focal point. He's the light. He's everything. And I'm okay with people following Jesus the best way that they can. I'm not going to judge them. In any way that they go, I think they should follow him. So I'm okay with her making that decision. So that's it.
I love that, Leo. Dan, what were you going to add?
I was just going to add, the directive to baptize our children at the age of 8 is in Revelation, and it's spelled out very specifically, and so really, honestly, the starting point is not, we're getting the cart before the horse with some of these ethical issues, because if God commanded something, then we need to explore, okay, what might be the reasons why, and is it a good thing? But at the end of the day, we're going to do it, even if it's not the way we might want to do things, because we prefer in our American society to do things differently. And I would say, I bring up American society because these questions are very white Western American ways of thinking. I doubt if anybody in Eastern countries will wrangle and get wrapped around the axle over questions of informed consent, because they have a very, very different perception of what a community is, what a family is, and our obligations to each other. And they don't have this Western white American individualism, right? So that's part of the discussion. And but was this given by revelation or not? Well, I believe it was, and we don't find out whether or not this directive was given by revelation by using an accusatory epistemology, or an epistemology that doesn't allow for faith and revelation and those kinds of things. So that is the starting point for a lot of us. It's spelled out in the revelation, and God gave that revelation. So, and I know that because of these things, this combination of witness testimony and personal revelation and experience and scripture and all these other things. So again, if I throw away that epistemology, then of course I'm going to be consumed with whatever questions my culture drives me to ask. And in white Western societies, we ask questions about the individual and my freedom, my agency, my autonomy. That's usually where our focus is. Very, very white, privileged Western ways of thinking. Again, in Eastern societies, I doubt you'll ever hear some of these arguments. They're very different ways of thinking about our obligations to the community and how we participate and belong, and so forth.
Well, and for a long time, It always bothered me when people would say that, because I was like, no, libertarian individualism, woohoo. And then they were like, but there is a community. You do realize that. I was like, oh, fine. And I'm maturing now and I'm becoming an old man. I'm like, yeah, there really is. And it's important and it's a big difference. So if I can answer my own question, because I've been thinking about this, my now 9-year-old, I asked him, I was like, but are you doing this for me or are you doing this for you, when he got baptized? And he was like, no, I'm definitely doing it for me. Like, I've decided I want to do this. And I was like, and in my head, I'm like, well, you're not going to say no, you're 8, right? Like, this is not, and at the same time, so I feel like you do, Leo, which is like, do you want to be as best a person as you know how to be? Do you want to get baptized? Do you want to follow Jesus? And I feel like that is okay. And at the same time, there's this wonderful quote from Ender's Game, Orson Scott Card. Valentine and Ender are kind of arguing, and all of a sudden he realizes that she's just trying to control him. And they're brother and sister. He loves her more than anybody else in the world. And he all of a sudden realizes, you've just been trying to manipulate me like all the others. And I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, Ender, of course I've been trying to control you. Manipulation is everything in life, right? Everyone is trying to control you or manipulate you in some way. The only choice you have is who you're going to allow to influence you, and whether you're going to allow people who love you and care about you, or if you're not. There's no one who isn't trying to manipulate you or encourage you in a certain way. Now, here are a couple of things that I am doing and that I think Valentine did in that book, which is, one, I'm going to be really transparent with my kids. I'm going to tell them, look, there's a chance we're cosplaying, man. And if that's the case, I look every day at everything I do and I go, you know what? I tried to be a better dad today because of this cosplay. That's a good thing for me. I tried to be a better husband. I tried to serve my community. I really do believe this stuff. I have had real experiences with God. And at the same time, if I end up being mistaken, it just doesn't bother me that much, right? I've lived my life the best way I know how, and I want you to ask questions. I want you to know for yourself. I want you to, all of those things. And at the same time, like, on the one hand, there's a bait and switch, right? If somebody comes to you with an intellectual question about the church and you say, well, just be a good person, that can be a way of minimizing and kind of deflecting. And at the same time, there's a part of that, which I think is actually really pivotal, which is like, okay, but double down on your commitment to be a moral person. Double down on your service and your kindness and your altruism, because as it turns, and like your self-discipline, and like, I can't tell you how many students I have who are coming into my office with faith crises. And I say, great, I'm really bad at this kind of thing, but I'm really good at yelling at people. So how's your sleep schedule? And they're like, oh, it's awful. All right, fix your sleep schedule. Will you do it? Okay, fine. They fix their sleep schedule and all of a sudden their testimony issues all go away, right? And like, I don't think that's coincidental, right? And I mean, if anybody's listening, I'm not saying that if you have serious concerns that it's sleep issues, but for a lot of people it is. For some people it is, right? And doubling down on who you want to be and the kind of life you want to live, I have found to be a really meaningful thing for anyone, no matter what situation they're in. And that's some good that I can do in that circumstance. Last thing I want to add
Benjamin,
on. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking to something critically important, like super important. And this is something that I teach a lot as well. When we talk about informed consent, let's talk about that first word, informed. Informed means having consumed some amount of information, right? So what is the very, very most relevant information that someone could consume as to whether or not they should make commitments in the church and covenants within the context of the church? Is it which disputed historical narrative about some minutia of church history fits more within my plausibility structure than somebody else's, or that person, or this YouTube influencer, or that podcaster, or whatever? I mean, is that really the most, when we talk about informed consent, is that your information that's causing you to be informed? When I talk about why I say that the church is true, what does that mean? I look at right now, okay? When I think about whether Joseph Smith was conversing with angels or not, I ask, are members of the church nowadays conversing with angels? Were the gifts of the Spirit legitimate in the early days of the church and in the work of the church? Well, how do you know? Ask the people around us. Are the gifts of the Spirit alive and well in the church and in the work of the church right now? Is the temple what we is, did the things happen that they say happened in the Kirtland temple? How do you find out? You don't go to a podcaster. You ask people right now who work in the temple, what goes on there? Is God involved in that work? Are we seeing the gifts of the Spirit alive and well there? That's informed consent, like when you're consuming that information, because that's verifiable with credible, sober-minded witnesses around us right now. You don't have to argue endlessly over competing, disputed historical narratives that contradict each other, put forward by this or that scholar or this or that commentator, right? So for me, informed consent, and this is just for me, the very, very most important information is what is happening right now in the church? Is God involved in the work of the church right now? And you can ask very, very credible, sober-minded witnesses sitting around us right now. Okay, it's not guesswork. It's not like, anyway, that's another one of my like 3 or 4 notes that I play everywhere I go. Right there.
There's
a present focused epistemology.
There's a fabulous talk that Elder Bednar gave at BYU in the last couple of years. In fact, in the last few months, probably, because he talks about COVID. And it was an answer to prayer of mine because I was asking about spiritual gifts in the church, actually. It's funny that you mentioned that. And he talks about the closure of the temples and the miracles that happened, and bears his testimony that God is a God of miracles. And it was an incredibly powerful moment for me because I had been asking about that. Where are the gifts today? And that was something that I was kind of trying to get more light and knowledge on. And, I think one of the evidences, to be clear, not the only one, and I want to clarify, there's minutia, and then there's really important things that you got to wrestle with, and that's okay. But knowing the difference between the two, I think, is a critical, like we got to calibrate somehow. And some of the minutia can become, I like what you said earlier about intellectual scrupulosity, right? Yeah.
It's this paralyzing fear of sinning intellectually, being wrong,
right,
or being mistaken, right? Just this all-consuming terror about being mistaken. Whereas, if you feel like you're walking with God, it's okay if I'm mistaken about this or that, and
I don't see how we could not be mistaken about a whole lot of stuff, right? There's going to be a lot where we go, oh, that's how it worked, right? And that just doesn't bother me anymore.
I price it in. It's priced in. Honestly.
That is an excellent way to say that. I have already priced it in. And to be clear, the intellectual understanding of the gospel, I believe, for me is solid and it needs to be. And at the same time, I also think there are other kinds of evidence that are valid and important, like whether it brings me joy, whether it deepens the meaning in my life, whether it makes me happy, whether it makes me a better person. They should not be the only evidence, but they are certainly part of the evidence, right? And at the same time, and I feel like this just needs to be said, there are a lot of people that are, worrying about their testimony right now. There are also a lot of people who are thinking vaccines aren't a thing right now, right? And that like the whole world is in a crisis of trust. And I hope nobody is super offended by that. I'm a little bit on the pro-vaccine side. But I think you can look in basically any direction, whether it's politics or whether it's medicine or science, everyone is looking at things with a closer magnifying glass right now. In fact, that I think is part of, I don't know, that is probably its own whole podcast that we could talk about another time. Yep. Leo, I feel like you've been wanting to dive in for a minute. Do you have something you wanted to add?
I'll say it again. When we use the word minutia, within the context of eternity and a relationship with the divine, I agree with you, Dan. I think that there's some things that we could call minutia, but time is measured to us and it's heavy, and the sins of other people and their mistakes are heavy and they weigh heavy on our hearts. It can be very, very difficult for us to feel like that's minutia when we're questioning or when we've concluded that the church isn't true. So I just wanted to make a call out to there's a lot of people who felt marginalized in the church over the years, and I feel like just one example, like for our missionaries who are teaching our Black friends, it'd be good for them to know about the priesthood ban in advance. I think the missionaries definitely need to have some kind of knowledge on that, so that when their questions come up, they can at least answer that. So shout out to any missionaries or future missionaries or parents of future missionaries. Please make sure that your kids, that you know about this priesthood ban, the temple and priesthood ban. Very, very important. And I think there may be an opportunity for missionaries, for example, and parents who are teaching their 7-year-olds to be baptized. I think it's very important for them to offer in lessons or before baptism, if it's a 7-year-old, hey, do you have any questions or things you want to talk about, things you might be worried about related to the church? I don't want to suggest that they go out and say, hey, you need to go to CES letter and read, right? That's too far, because that's their narrative, that's their opinion of the facts of history, right? That's Jeremy Reynolds, that's his opinion. What I'm saying is that the missionaries could definitely say to investigators, hey, our church has some trouble in our history, and I've wrestled with some of those things, and I'd be happy to talk with you about those, any concerns you have. And if you haven't prepared with some knowledge about those issues in church history or current events like women in the priesthood or LGBT issues, you have no knowledge of that, which is very common because they're 18-year-old kids, then I think members, wherever you are, if you're listening, talk to your missionaries, call them, text them tomorrow or tonight, whenever you're listening to this, text them as soon as possible and say, hey, I know about some of church history. Can I please be there and talk to any investigators that you have on your list about these topics? I would be happy to talk with them and help them to wrestle through some of these topics. It's better for us to be proactive than reactive on this, is my opinion. And I know the missionary department is not having that be part of the Preach My Gospel. There's no chapter on, hey, gospel topics essays. Read these and prepare to teach a lesson about the gospel topics essays. Okay, but from someone who's been through this, been through the fire, has a lot of people who have left the church who I love dearly and who have this real concern about not knowing about these things about before getting baptized, then please, I would say, do all these people a favor and educate yourselves before you go out and serve a mission or you're interacting with someone who's investigating. Be prepared to answer those questions and even offer proactively to discuss those things. Not introduce doubt, but I think we need to be as close to that line of sharing as we can be so that people don't feel like they were deceived. When, 6 months down the road, they stumble across Fair Mormon and they lose their testimony, or Fair LDS now, right? Because no one taught them that before they got baptized. And so I hear that argument, it resonates with me, I understand it. So as the body of Christ, we need to be a little bit better about talking openly about these topics. And
Yes,
anyway.
100%.
I think that's spot on. And to be fair, I served as a missionary going on 15 years ago now. And even then, it was, here's some things I want you to know, right? Here are the 4 lessons, and here are some other things you need to know. You're getting the very, very basics. And by the way, I don't think it's wrong that we focus on your commitment to Christ, that we focus on, do you want to live the commandments? Do you want to be a better person? Those are the fundamental questions. But also, this is going to be a long commitment, and this is the beginning of the path, not the end of the path. Here are some things you're going to learn along the way. I want you to know what they are. And the same is true for my kids. I want them to be as informed as possible, and I want them to exercise their agency. Right. Go ahead, Dan.
Leo brought up just a wonderful example, and that is, the priesthood and temple ban. And I would suggest anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you want to see like a really interesting and extraordinary, wonderful test case for this idea, watch the video interview that Terrell Givens did with Darius Gray a few years ago, and watch how it's on YouTube. Darius Gray, he talks through, what happened when he was informed of, of these things, and like exactly what happened, and it's a really remarkable story, and I strongly recommend it. And honestly, it probably won't fit within some people's paradigms, some people's plausibility structures, but that's okay. It's still there, and it's a very valid test case for this principle.
It's a fabulous example. I feel like on any of these issues, you could find people who have left over them, and you've probably found people who have stayed because of them, because of a testimony they've received, or a witness they've had, or an experience they've had. A thought in passing really quick, one of the things that's occurred to me is, I think I've been lucky because I went to a Catholic school growing up, and it was a marvelous experience. For 3 years, I was at a Catholic school. And I remember arguing with my Catholic religion teacher after class for about 45 minutes, telling her all the bad things that Catholicism had done. And finally, I kind of got her back up. It's super rude. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I'm so sorry. I was such a jerk. Finally, I got to one that really stumped her, because she had a lot of really good answers. And finally, she just looked at me and said, Ben, that kind of stuff is everywhere. It's in every church. I was like, well, no, that's not true. And I actually think there was a lot more wisdom in that, right? If you look at an institution, you're going to find one with problems. And I don't see a way around that. And at the same time, I think I'm at a university, when we're talking about informed consent, kids choose to take my class based off of rate my professors, for Pete's sake, right? Like, this is not a very high bar. And yet at the same time, like, I know of universities where really bad things have happened and people still go there. And that's because at the end of the day, we kind of recognize that, things are imperfect. That's just how it goes. I want to end with this question. So you all said, you've said a lot of things that I think speak to, my questions about informed consent. I actually took the opposite view when I was reading your article, which is, you're talking way too much about faith. Like, there's already a lot of informed consent going on. There's like checks in the way and like barriers and like, whoa, I know you want to get baptized, but you need to get interviewed twice, right? Like, there are people actively throwing up barriers saying, hold on a second, we want to make sure you're doing this for the right reason and you know what you're doing. And so I kind of want to push on this idea. And I think there is a legitimate criticism, and I'll raise that first. And that is, because we are such a tight culture, because we have such high expectations, we can create a culture of say the expected thing instead of saying the true thing. And so if you're the youngest in a family of 9 kids, and all of them are faithful, active members, and you don't really have a testimony, but it's your turn to get baptized, and you feel like you should probably say that you have a testimony, like, I think there is a problem. And this is something we need to talk more about as, not on the general level, but as a ward level, right? As a family level. Hey, it's more important that you tell the truth than it is that you say what you think we want to hear in an interview. And I actually think that's a really important one. And I think that's one where I felt like, as I was reading that comment, I was like, you know what? I can see that. And that's something that I want to be careful with my kids. It's something I want to tell my students and my friends. Like, you need to be 100% truthful. And if you're not sure about your testimony, that's okay. You're not going to get kicked out. You're not going to be yelled at. The conversation is going to be, let's talk about a plan. Let's get you somewhere. Anyway, now I'm answering my own question. Do you feel like,
Love it.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I love that. That's something that honestly keeps me awake at night, is with my interactions with my kids and the church. I really am trying to discern, okay, are you being authentic with me? Are you really expressing what you honestly feel? Or are you looking around and just doing what you think you're supposed to do as a member of this family or a member of the church? And I would much rather that my kids honestly have a path that doesn't look like the other kids even, but arrive at their faith honestly and with integrity, than try to pretend to convictions that they don't have. I would much, much rather that be the case. Anyway,
Well, and I was
Leo.
just, there's a great quote by Elder, I'm being rude again. Leo, you're next. There's a great quote by Elder Holland, and I can't find it right now, so you'll forgive me for looking for it, where he essentially says, if if one of my kids was put in jail or came home teen and pregnant or any of those things, of course I would, my heart would break for them, and I would have very strong feelings about their place with the commandments and all of those things, and I would feel twice as bad. I would never forgive myself if they felt like they couldn't come and tell me.
Right.
I think there's something about that, something behind that is really important. That authenticity, that tell the truth, that like, hey, you are where you are, and I love you no matter what. Anyway, Leo, what were you going to add?
Okay, well, one of my least favorite, we'll call it a Mormon phrase, right? Because it's cultural Mormon stuff. I don't like it, so I'll use the word Mormon. Is this idea of no empty seats at the table, right? That's basically what we're talking about. And I'm not going to judge those parents who listen to this who have used that. And I've heard it from extremely good people talking about their family. But the idea that you're basically saying you have to sit in that seat, you can't leave that table. BITE model I'll list them off. It's behavior, information, control. These are all the control. Thought control and emotional control, right? And we check all those boxes sometimes when we're talking about how we interact with people. Does someone want a mission because they're feeling like they've got peer pressure? That's why they went. Our kids getting baptized just because mom and dad said. Yeah. And so that's really important. We got to be able to address this and talk about it openly. And we're not a cult. We're what do you call a new religious movement? That's the right academic term for our church, because we're new, but we're not a cult. That's different. It's different. But we do have some practices, some tendencies to pressure, to coerce. For example, just think about this: a young man, 12-year-old, who starts passing the sacrament, right? And he messes up. He goes to the bishop, and the bishop says, "Okay, you're going to have to wait, 3 months or whatever." It may not be trying to induce shame, but that kid feels shameful, right? And I'm not telling bishops how to run their wards, but I'm just saying we've got stuff that we got to be very, very careful about. And it helps that we're the true church, the only true and living church, that Christ's in control, and that we have, real true ordinances. We have priesthood keys. All that really helps. But at the same time, we've got to be very careful about avoiding controlling our kids, especially. And so I'm all in favor of being open, honest, as age appropriate as we can be, transparent, open dialogue, use correct terminology, everything you can. If you're a youth leader, appropriate boundaries with your youth. But I think as much as we can, be open and honest all the time. And I'm a huge advocate of that. And I'm sure people that read my article that have left the church are like, this guy is promoting gaslighting and no logic and just a pawn for the church. And now you're hearing me say, hey, we got to improve. And that's who I am. I'm an honest truth seeker, and I'm willing to admit when we have things that we can improve upon. And I think we have some room for improvement when it comes to control.
It's interesting. Brian Kaplan is somebody that I really respect, and I follow all of his stuff. He wrote a book called The Case for Open Borders, and he goes on a podcast. He likes to debate people on immigration. It's really fun to listen to him. And in one of them, somebody said, "Well, you haven't convinced me." It was the end of the debate, and he said, "Well, you haven't convinced me." He said, "Oh, no, that wasn't my goal. My goal was to come in with what you thought was an extreme opinion and to have you leave going, oh, well, I still don't agree with them, but that actually makes some sense." I think there's something about what we're saying here tonight that hopefully is the same thing, which is that we've got these two camps, and it can very quickly turn into this infighting and anger. Infighting is the wrong word, tribal, kind of conflict. I think the goal of tonight's podcast has been, take a peek inside the other side's camp and realize that, a lot of what people are calling fraudulent is actually people who just believe this stuff. And I can take the moniker that we're, silly or foolish or that makes sense to me. But I can promise you that my belief is earnest, and I actually do believe this stuff. And I really think that there's some good in it. I love what you said, Leo. I feel like, I mean, shame and guilt is another one that I feel like could be its own whole podcast, because I feel like there's a really important role for that stuff. It needs to be done well, but a life with no consequences is, and this is because I'm a totalitarian. That is to say, I was a public school teacher. And, you know, we run our classrooms and we have rewards and incentives, and those can be overdone. They can be done poorly, and you can become a tyrant. And at the same time, there's a role for that, right? And it's important. And at the end of the day, a bishop needs to use a tremendous amount of wisdom in making sure that they are teaching and loving and being kind, and that they're never putting somebody in a position where it's easier to say the thing that's expected rather than say the right thing. And that's hard to pull off, right? Super hard to pull off. But I think that is absolutely key. And I think that's really important. Well, I'm going to leave the last word with you two. Why don't you say, if there's anything else that you wanted to add, one last thing that you would want to say to folks, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Do you want to go first, or should I, Dan?
You go ahead. I actually have said more than I intended.
We'll take it all out in editing. Don't worry about it.
So I prepared these closing remarks. No, I'm just buying time to prepare something. No, I will talk about just trust at the end here. This all really comes down to trust, I think, for everybody who's listening. For those who have lost trust in the institution of the church, have lost trust in the feelings that you've had as far as tying those to God, you know, through the Holy Ghost. Who have been surprised by information that you didn't learn in what you thought was the trusted institution, right? Growing up or as an adult convert, and you were surprised by new information. If you're listening to this and you have lost trust, I just want to say that I love you and I hear you and understand how difficult that is. I don't have a solution right here in the next minute that I have, quick fix, but I do have love and I have empathy and deep wounds that have been healed. And I know that people are seeking healing from not feeling like they were informed when they consented to baptism and other things in the covenant path, right? There's these deep wounds that feel like they are difficult to heal. And time and an absence from the church, I think, brings a lot of, some people would call peace, right? Relief from these things. And I know that that's a worthwhile goal for you, right? Those of you who are listening, and being able to have some relief from these burdens of the church, right? Of these deep-rooted concerns that you have. And my, I guess, only invitation, other than I'm just saying that I love you and let me love you, if you can reach out to me and find me online, I'll be happy to talk to you. I love talking to people, and I love to just hear you out. And, you know, you can rip on my article, rip on whatever you need to let me know how concerned you are. That's fine. I'm happy to hear you. But I would just offer, with great love, a different kind of healing. And that healing is through your beautiful Savior. He brought me so much peace and light and love. I have no more resentment in my heart. I resented the church. I was really, really angry. And I resented people that are close to me that I loved, because I thought they deceived me, that they withheld information. And it's been 10 years since my faith journey really started in this difficult path. And I would just like to say, if you'd be open to it, to try to heal by turning to Jesus Christ. He has healed me in such profound ways that I have no more animosity in my heart. Everything has been healed. And I still have questions sometimes, definitely. Still have doubts sometimes even. And But as far as feeling angry or feeling resentful, feeling bitter, or feeling upset, any of those negative emotions that I have towards the church, and also I had some negative emotions towards those who left the church, who almost got me to leave. And I love those people, and I have no resentment in my heart towards those people. And Jesus Christ has changed my heart, and I just would invite you to try again and reach out to me, and I'd be happy to love you through that process if you're open to it. So that's it.
I appreciate that, Leo. Dan, go ahead.
Nope, I just agree 100% with what Leo said. I've had the same outcome. It's part of why Leo and I are battle buddies on so many things, is our story is so similar. But I don't have, I know what it feels like to feel deceived, to feel misinformed, and all of those things. And I just don't feel those things anymore. I don't have hostility toward even the people who led me to feel those things, right? So it's a wonderful outcome. It really is.
Well, and I guess that's the note that I kind of want to end on, which is, I felt a lot of things. I've definitely got wrapped around the axle. I like the way that you said that on a couple of things. I've never had the experience of feeling lied to. And at the same time, I can at least intellectually grasp what that must entail and how terrible and frustrating that must be. And at the same time, I hope that it is taken in the right spirit when I say, I think anyone, I think back to some of the really heinous cases you hear in the news when somebody who's been victimized in some way sees the perpetrator, and they have a conversation in the courtroom or 20 years down the road or whatever it is, and they can finally look at them and say, look, I'm at peace. Like, you can't hurt me anymore. Now, I would actually disagree on where the church is with that. I don't think the church is victim, but that's fine. That's not my story. That's your story. What I can tell you is that place of peace is something that I hope for you, independent of what happened or where you are. And something that I can do is say, I'm not going to say things lightly. I'm not going to tell my kids the easy version of the story. I'm not going to just pat them on the head and say, oh, stop worrying so much and just go on your mission. I'm going to teach them as best I can to have informed consent. I'm going to teach them as best I can to ask the hard questions and to wrestle and to grapple. And that's part of the joy and the richness and the beauty and the texture of life, is to have some bit of ambiguity, a lot of ambiguity, and to still have to figure out how to put your foot down one in front of the other day after day, and how to be the best person that I can be. So I can't fix that. And if I'm ever interviewing somebody, I don't think I have had to interview, well, I guess if I ever have to interview somebody again, it'll be the same kind of a thing where I will try and encourage people to be as honest and open as they can be. And I think that's something that I can say in good faith, which is that I am very careful these days about what I say and how I say it. And I try to be as honest as I possibly can be. Well, thank you both for joining me. This has been a fabulous conversation. And I'm sure we'll talk again very soon. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.